we're going to begin now. My name is Christiana Lilly. I'm the president of the Society of Professional Journalists Florida. Thank you all for joining us this evening. And I'd like to introduce our moderator. Her name is Suzette Speaks. She's a good friend and colleague of our chapter. She's the former president of the South Florida Black Journalists Association, and she currently sits on that board. She's a television host, she's an attorney, and we love her. So we're gonna have her join the panel today. And we are motivated to put together this panel, especially in light of Me Too, Time's Up. And we really wanted to shed a light on what is going on in newsrooms, what is going on in the workplace in general, and talk about what's going on, how we can fix it, what we can do as individuals and a newsroom, and then how we can change the newsroom culture. So I'm gonna have Suzette come in here and she's gonna introduce our panel, and then we're gonna begin. And again, I'm at the bottom at the Q&A. If anybody has any questions or comments, feel free to put them in. And then towards the end of the panel, we're gonna set aside a couple minutes to have those questions. If you have it for somebody in particular, please put their name there. And again, this is about ending harassment and bullying. So if we have any inappropriate questions, any inappropriate comments, you will be booted out. Thank you.
Hello and good evening, everyone. How are we? Welcome, panelists.
Hello.
Thank you. We're so excited to have each and every one of you here. Thank you guys for joining in online. Once again, my name is Suzette Speaks. I'm honored to be the moderator tonight, and I applaud SPJ for taking on this timely topic. While people are still coming on, I'm going to introduce our distinguished panel members. I'm going to start with Miss Allison Bethel McKenzie. Can you wave to us, Allison, so everyone knows who you are? Welcome, welcome. She is the newly minted Executive Director of Society of Professional Journalists and has more than 30 years of experience as an award-winning reporter, bureau chief, senior editor, and media trainer. She has worked for, and the list is very long, the Boston Globe, the Detroit News, Legal Times, the Nassau Guardian, the Miami Herald, the Los Angeles Times, Poughkeepsie Journal, and the now defunct State Times in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. She's a co-founder and former vice president of the board of directors of Caribbean Media Institute, and acts as an advisor consultant for the AntillianNews.org. She is a native of Miami, hey, where we're broadcasting from. Yay, Miami. And again, she has been a member, former board member of the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. Welcome to
Thank you.
Miss Allison Bethel McKenzie.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Our next panelist is Miss Coll Steele. She is a fellow attorney like myself and president and co-founder of the Purple Campaign, a nonprofit organization that addresses workplace sexual harassment. Before launching the Purple Campaign earlier this year, Steele was a litigator in private practice in Washington, D.C., where she also worked for several years in politics and on Capitol Hill as both a staffer in the United States Senate and House of Representatives. Excuse me. I'd like to mention that she earned her law degree from the Harvard Law School, and she served on the board of the Harvard Women's Law Association and the American Constitution Society, and as the executive policy editor of the Harvard Law and Policy Review. Welcome, Miss Coll Steele.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. And last but certainly not least, we welcome Miss Carrie Hughes Weeks. Welcome, Carrie.
Hi, how are you?
Great, thank you for joining us tonight. She's the co-founder of Press Forward, a newly launched initiative to stop sexual harassment and assault in newsrooms, create safe and healthy workplaces for women and men, and to ensure the integrity of the American press. She began her career in journalism while attending the Duke University, first as an intern at the ABC affiliate in Durham, and as a summer intern for Good Morning America. Upon graduation, she moved to New York City and worked in news media for Entertainment Weekly, HBO's On the Record with Bob Costas, CNN's American Morning, and Fox News' Dayside with Linda Bester. I would like to welcome the one and only Miss Carrie Hughes Weeks. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm excited about being here.
Well, ladies, we're going to begin once again. To all of our guests and attendees watching, please feel free to leave comments. We want to hear from you. Again, this is a community conversation. Of course, we have these experts with us, but we want to make sure we are developing a dialogue, both among journalists and non-journalists who have joined us. So we want to again welcome one and all as we commence our discussion. So I'd like to start first with our Executive Director, Ms. Allison Bethel McKenzie. Can you tell us a little bit about the new initiative that has been kicked off recently by SBJ Florida?
Our goal is to help women in the news business, whether it's radio, TV, newspaper, online, navigate issues surrounding sexual harassment. And for us, it's not just sexual harassment in the newsroom, but often women are covering stories where sources might sexually harass or be inappropriate, especially knowing that the reporter needs information and may try to make some sort of unwanted sexual advancement. So we have launched this initiative to let women know where they can go, most specifically to let them know what the law says about sexual harassment, and to define exactly what is sexual harassment, because many people, including many women, disagree on what is sexual harassment, what it is, and what rises to the level of actually reporting it to your boss. And we're also hoping to help editors, male and female, determine how they deal with sexual harassment. We'll also be addressing very shortly something that I'm very keen on and I've written a lot about and done a lot of research on, which is online harassment of female journalists.
Awesome. Well, we're going to unpack that initiative a little bit further in our discussion. Ladies, let's define our terms. I would like each of you to just jump in. How do we define sexual harassment?
Sure, I can start with, I'll give a little bit of a legal definition. And then I think one of the interesting things that's happening in the wake of Me Too is that a lot of workplaces are also creating definitions of behavior that's acceptable or not, that goes above and beyond what the law requires. But traditionally, under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is when we first outlawed gender-based discrimination, there are two main kinds of sexual harassment in the workplace. One is quid pro quo harassment, which is really the most egregious and typical kind that I think we all would know it when we see it, which involves, a manager or supervisor asking for sexual favors or other kinds of sexual advances in exchange for something at work, whether that's a promotion or an assignment or whatever it might be. The other kind is a hostile work environment, which tends to be something that is caused by a workplace where behavior, maybe inappropriate comments or jokes or other behavior is accepted and normalized that creates an environment that makes women uncomfortable in the workplace and ultimately results in gender discrimination. Now, I think a lot of other kinds of harassment you've identified, bullying, online harassment, often interactions that take place with people outside the workplace, are things that we're really reevaluating now in the wake of Me Too and may not be covered by the technical legal definition of an employer-employee situation, but are also very much on the table, I think, now for discussion.
Absolutely. That was very broad, and I think we captured most of what is now considered sexual harassment and abuse. Ladies, are there any other additions you'd like to add to that definition?
I think a lot of women are reevaluating whether or not they were harassed or somehow coerced into having relationships with superiors. Because generally speaking, it is not ethical or right for a publisher or an editor-in-chief to approach in any kind of sexual form. It takes it to another level, a subordinate. So I think that people are sort of looking at those issues as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Allison. Would you like to add anything on, Carrie?
Sorry, I was muted there. yeah, Press Forward has sort of come together to address these issues of culture change and looking at, what is harassment. And part of it is that, a lot, as you guys have said, like a lot of people don't know what it is, and what a legal term, what it is legally, and what your options are when something happens to you. And so, we believe this conversation is really important, and we as an organization plan to be conveners on the topic as we go forward and try to find real concrete solutions for this.
Excellent. Well, you mentioned that your organization, Press Forward, has been literally at the forefront of this issue. Tell us more about what you guys are doing through your organization.
Sure. So we came together in the wake back in October when the revelations about these powerful men in media came out. And there were a lot of stories that were in the press and people that went on the record or even went on background for these stories. But we all came together on social media. So it's one of the good things about social media that you hear these days. And we connected. And then as the Mark Halperin story came out and Charlie Rose and Matt Lauer, we all continued to come together. And there was a big group of us. And we were initially just talking about our experiences, but then it quickly turned to, we can't let this moment go without doing something. And so, due to time constraints and families and things, we wound up being down to a group of 12, and we are really working on 5 initiatives. And, our goal is to change cultures in newsrooms. And that starts, it's top-down change, but it really has to happen from within and from everybody pitching in, and we're trying to find best practices and things like that to go forward that can be recommendations for everyone to adhere to, so that we can get rid of this problem as much as we can. And one of the things that we're hearing from people who continue to reach out to us is that it's not just sexual harassment, it's bullying, it's equality, and we're hearing from journalists of color who don't speak out for fear of being a troublemaker. And we're here to try to represent everyone and really push for equality for all women. And really our mission is to elevate women in the workplace, period. So that means a lot of things.
Excellent. Excellent. And finally, since we're all describing our backgrounds and the different organizations we're involved in, Allie, give us a feel of what you do through the Purple Campaign.
Yeah, so the Purple Campaign is really focused on ensuring that the right kind of policy reform comes out of the Me Too movement. I think a lot of awareness has now been raised about this systemic problem across industries. And we're trying to make sure that both workplace policies, internal policies, but also public policies and the law rise to meet that change and the new expectations that I think employees and workers across industries have. So we're partnering with groups like Press Forward to work on specific industries. So obviously Press Forward is leading on this issue in the media. There are other groups leading on this issue who we partnered with in other industries. And then in some places where there hasn't really been a grassroots movement, we are trying to encourage people to make change within those industries as well. So we have ways for regular people to get involved and take action on our website. And we're also producing free resources for employers and employees who want to start a conversation in their own workplace, and generally working to support lawmakers and public policy experts who we think are taking the right approach to create positive change for women in the workplace out of Me Too.
Excellent, excellent. And I wanted to now delve into a little bit of a description of how big or how vast this problem is. I was reading a study by the EEOC that gave the figure of 75% of people who reported harassment in the workplace experiencing retaliation as a result. Can one of you give us an idea about the numbers, if you will, in terms of how many people, particularly in media, are experiencing or have experienced, and perhaps we don't know because not everyone comes forward, but as far as reportable, how many people are we talking about?
So I'll take that, Suzette, if you'd like. What we're hearing is there are a lot of different studies out there. The EEOC one, I think, is kind of the gold standard. But there have been other ones that have come out since this that, 80% of women have experienced this kind of behavior in the workplace. And that's a lot of people. Retaliation is a real thing. And if, as a group of Press Forward, in the last 2 days, we spent a lot talking about what that means. And it's not just about fear of losing your job, but when you're a young woman just starting out in this profession and you're eager and you want to move up, your reputation is on the line. So if you're not believed, that can really do damage to your future. And if just as much as there was a whisper network among women about who these, men were abusing their power, there's a whisper network for young people who are viewed as troublemakers, or, maybe you don't want to hire them because they did this. And that's got to stop. And it's really about building a culture of trust, so that people will come forward and not fear that retaliation. So the retaliation piece of it has just really got to be knocked out for this to be fixed.
Absolutely. Anyone else want to illumine us as far as the problem and the vastness of what people are experiencing?
I think that a thing that to be aware of in the media is that it's a man's game, and it always has been. And while we don't have enough women who are in leadership roles, and some of the women who are in leadership roles are not necessarily pro-woman. I mean, not to be provocative, but it's true. And I think that you're in a situation where you want to cover the most important stories that the men cover. Whenever we have something that is really big that happens in the country, especially in past times, you'd have the people on television were the big 3 or 4 men who would come on because they had gravitas and whatnot. And women have always wanted to sort of be in that game in the newsroom. And I think because of that, you've had a lot of women who've put up with things and sort of looked the other way, or some of them may not have looked the other way and may have said something or reported it or whatever. But it's always been sort of a man's game in a way. And if you want it to advance, your best thing would be to sort of not make trouble. And we have to get women to understand that that's not okay, and to get bosses to understand that it's not okay to not promote women because they look the other way or don't say anything. But if you want the best stories, the best beat, then you kind of look the other way. And that's just kind of historically how it's been. And we have to get out of that mode.
I agree with you. And I want to piggyback on a point that I think Carrie made and that you are making as far as just the dynamics of the newsroom, meaning that a lot of young talent comes out very eager and ready and willing, wanting to please their superiors and wanting to show that they make the grade. And it creates a power dynamic that is not in favor of the subordinate. And you also talk about the gender roles traditionally being many more men in positions of power, as in most industries as far as historically in this country. And that hasn't changed much. So where do we begin with addressing this issue? Is it an issue where we start with talking to men who are in these positions of power and influence? Is it education at the earlier stages in journalism school and young folks coming into the industry? Where exactly do we start? Because it seems as if no matter how old you are, a la Gretchen Carlson and folks who have longer careers, they're still suffering from this type of abuse. Where do we begin with trying to shed some light on it, as well as to get folks to be aware of what's happening and to stop it when they see it?
Sure. So Suzette, I think it really does. It begins it's all phases. So what you're saying is, do you start in the journalism schools? We've actually had a lot of journalism schools reach out to us because they want this in their curriculum. They're not addressing this in their curriculum. They're teaching you how to be a good journalist and how to go report on a story, but you're not learning what work life is going to be like and the challenges you may face there. So we're working with them to put this in the curriculum so that they're prepared, and we're stopping it with that generation. But to fix what's already there, and the people who are there now, and to help them and assist them, we're working on trainings. Trainings are broken. There's all kind of studies that say what's going on right now. They're just ineffective because somebody's sitting on the internet having to click yes, 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 and okay, they've checked that box and they don't have to think about it, and they didn't learn. And they're also more focused on how not to get in trouble versus what to do if you have a problem. So we're working with the Poynter Institute on creating new trainings that can be sent out across the country to newsrooms everywhere. And the hope is that they're effective. That's the goal, obviously. So I would think that, it's culture change is really going to have to come from the top down, though. And a leader is going to have to lead and show that they have those values. And, we've been fortunate enough to be talking with all the networks and see what everyone is doing. And some of these leaders are sitting down with their people and saying, please feel safe to come forward. And we recognize that's still not quite enough because the trust has to be built. And building that trust between HR, between the managers and the staffers, and between management and between the executives, it's just paramount to creating this change.
Would you like to add, Allie?
Yeah, I agree with Carrie. I think it is all of the above. And, one of the things that we're especially focused on is, I think, an issue you raised earlier about the lack of reporting that's even happening right now. Another statistic that jumps out to me from that EEOC report is that 70% of people don't report harassment to a manager or a supervisor in the first place. And so that is not surprising when you consider the fact that when people have been reporting historically, at best, generally nothing's been done because oftentimes the employer wants to protect, the person with more power, or is just looking to reduce their liability risk. Or worse, often the person reporting does experience that retaliation that you mentioned earlier. And so the message that's sent is why would you report? And so I think that's why the top-down policy reform change and the message sent from the top is so important, which is why engaging men is really a critical part of this too, because they are in leadership still in so many industries, and without their I think bringing them to the table and working with them to explain and educate a little bit more about why reform is so necessary, we won't end up with the lasting change that's really needed. So I agree, it's a lot to do, but they're all really important components of fixing the problem.
Excellent point. Allison, have we started doing enough of that top-down approach, do you think, when it comes to targeting leaders, as Ms. Carrie just spoke about, not just as a quick, click online, as far as doing trainings that are less interactive and not live? Are we doing enough to try to reach out to those leaders who can set a different tone in our newsrooms?
We've had, I can't remember a newspaper I worked at that did not have a sexual harassment policy. And this is from the 80s. And early 80s, mid 90s, 2000s, they all had sexual harassment policies. The problem is being able to enforce them and being able to make women feel as though they're not going to not get the best job because they report it. And that's a psychological and a cultural thing that I think Carrie really pointed to that has to be overcome. I think it can be overcome. I think it will take some while. I think that you have certain segments or certain women, minority women, particularly Black and Hispanic, who won't report it, who won't talk about it, who it's just, they won't, for cultural reasons or whatever other reasons. And I think that we have to have a way to, when it comes from the top down, to ensure that women still get the big stories, because at the end of the day, that's what it's about. It's about being able to get that career-breaking story, being able to report, do the war stories, to do the stories that really matter. We can say that that's not what it's about, but that really is, when I talk to members and I talk to women, that is what determines whether they go to the next level in their career. Absolutely. Whether they move from reporter to on-air talent prime time, or whether they move from a rookie reporter to an editor or to a senior editor, a bureau chief, or even on the investigative team. And if women feel as though they report it and they don't get those promotions, then we have an issue. So I think we have two areas to work on. We have to work on helping women to believe that reporting does not mean that your career stops the minute you walk into that editor's office or that producer's office or HR's office to report it. And we have to make sure that the people at the top ensure that their position doesn't stop there, that they are able to climb, and they're not this sort of person in the newsroom who, you can't say anything to her because she'll report it and you'll lose your job.
Excellent point. Let's look at some real world application. Say someone who's on our conversation here is experiencing some sort of mistreatment or abuse, or has seen someone else having to deal with that. What are the steps? What are the steps they should take within their workplace to ensure that it's addressed and that it's addressed appropriately?
Well, I think that if you witness someone else, or you think someone else is being harassed, I'm a proponent of pulling the sister aside and talking to her as a friend and saying, are you okay? Do you feel somehow pressured? Are there unwanted sexual advancements that are being made towards you? I think it's important to talk to the woman before reporting it, because you can go and report it and she can deny it and then nothing happens and it can spiral downward. So I think it's really important to talk to the woman, try to make her feel safe, and even go as far as saying, I'll go into the room with you, I'll go to HR with you, because I have witnessed what I think is inappropriate behavior towards you, etc. But I'm also a proponent of documenting. I think you have to document, because it becomes a he say, she said he did this, he denies it. So I think it's really important to document it as best as possible. And then to sort of compose yourself and go in and say, this is what's happened. This has happened 3 times. This has happened 5 times on these dates. And it's made me feel a certain sort of way. But Carrie may have.
Yeah, Allison, yeah. I have a couple things. So one, I think you've hit the nail on the head. You've got to document. And I'll just, as a resource for everyone, betterbrave.com. They're some friends of ours in this workspace. And they have some great tools for people who are out there who need to document and don't know how to do it. It'll help you print emails, and they have great guides for what to do, how to document it, and if you see it and you're a friend, as you say, or a manager, and you see something happening to someone, what you can do to help them. They have some great guides on that topic for everyone, just as a resource. Mm-hmm. And we are fortunate enough to have Gretchen Carlson on our board, who's been a huge proponent for this issue and has written a fantastic book that I can't help but recommend to everyone. But she's allowed us to reprint her sort of 12 steps on what to do if you're being harassed. And a lot of it's about documentation, and it takes you from, the moment it first happens all the way through, how the policies you need to do, being aware, and Allie can probably talk about this more, but being aware of, time constraints and statute of limitations and when you have to report. I believe it's, Allie, you correct me, please, but I believe it is 365 days you have to report it to the EEOC if you plan to file a lawsuit, if that's something you want to do. And and so there's a lot of rules and regulations around that, and being aware of that is the most important thing you can do to, protect yourself and your rights.
Is the EEOC the first? Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you, Allie. Just wanted to betterbrave.com. Just wanted to reiterate, as well as Gretchen Carlson's book.
Yes, and on our website, if you go on under Newsroom Resources. Yeah,
and I also wanted releases on your website, Gretchen Carlson's book.
Yes, it's we have a piece entitled "What to Do If You're Being Harassed," and it outlines, basically pulls the highlights of Gretchen's 12 points. I mean, the chapter itself is 40 pages, so we couldn't reprint the whole thing, but we pulled out the nuts and bolts and give you the resources that you need there as well.
Excellent. And I was wondering if, and I'm going to let you follow up, Miss Allie, if the EEOC you think should be your first phone call.
So I was going to add just two quick things. I think most of it has been covered, but one thing I would add to the point about, the EEOC reporting is that as a preemptive step, I think that anybody who's not sure what their workplace policies are around reporting sexual harassment should ask those questions. And it's shocking to me how often those are not really made clear. Even in law firms that I worked at, I've been onboarded and had no information provided to me about how I would report something, and then looking back in my employee manuals, there doesn't answer a lot of those questions there. So that's a lot of what we're doing, is pushing workplaces to make those policies clearer and more transparent. I think trainings are one way to do that, but the policies have to be there in the first place. And so a lot of employers have a mandatory arbitration requirement for sexual harassment claims. That's something that we're seeing start to get rolled back, which I think is positive, but you may not, your rights differ, I think, based on your workplace policies, and the deadlines that apply to you, both in terms of going to the EEOC or going to your workplace, are going to vary. So it's just important, I think, to know, hopefully before anything even happens, but certainly after something does, what you need to do and by when. And, I think the other thing I would just add is that there are some counseling resources that are out there too. RAIN has a hotline you can call just in case you need more of the, support services. I think there are a lot of groups out there, but RAIN's hotline is the main one I would mention that, can provide just some counseling. I think your first call should be to whoever it is that you trust the most, either within your workplace or a mentor within your industry. And they will, be able to help you think through who the best next steps are. I wish I could tell everybody that you should go straight to HR and report it, but I'm not sure that's the best advice in certain situations where retaliation is really common, and it may not be, the best way for you to get relief. It may be that you want to talk to a lawyer first. And so I think that whoever it is that you feel most comfortable sharing the most information with, I think talking about it is always helpful. And these outside resources like Better Brave and RAIN can also be there for you if there isn't an obvious person in your workplace.
Excellent sources there. Let's switch it over now to managers. Post Me Too, what can managers or people who are in leadership roles within the newsroom be doing to help create a healthier environment?
I'll speak to that first. So one of the things that we continue to find sort of funny is a rule that came out of Stanford. So I guess it's okay to say, just a no a-hole rule. You don't want any of those in your workplace, and there should be zero tolerance for that kind of behavior. Starting there, and really managers need to be fostering simple things like the golden rule. Following the golden rule, you're just not going to get into trouble. And if you lead by example, your newsroom is going to be a much healthier place. And going back to that trust and safety, building that trust and safety, so where your employees know that if they come to you or they go to HR, that something is going to be done. That is just really, really important. And then I think I'll stop there for a minute.
Okay, so setting the tone by the form of leadership they offer, A.
Sure.
And leading by example, B. Mm-hmm. What would you like to add, please?
I think it's important for women, especially if they're younger than their subordinates, the people who report to them, that they not be intimidated to approach the men and talk to the men. Because I think that's really hard. I mean, I started really young as an editor. And when I was 25, I had a male reporter who was 60. And it was intimidating. You know, so he made all sorts of jokes about how I'm young and why is he reporting to someone who's like his granddaughter's age and whatever. And so I think it's like really important for female managers to be able to have the skills to approach men and not be intimidated to approach them and say, listen, you know, and have these hard conversations. I think that, you know, your jokes are inappropriate, and maybe physically you're being inappropriate. I think that's really important. But what's also important is that manager, male or female, but particularly if the manager is female, is backed up by the top boss, and is supported by that person. Because I think managers also have issues. It's systemic. It's not just reporters, or I think it also goes into management. And I think women in management have as many issues, and maybe even more, because they meet behind closed doors a lot and in smaller groups where decisions are made, and they go to cocktails and this sort of thing. And I think that I think women managers especially need to feel empowered to be able to talk to men.
Excellent. Yes.
I'll add one more thing that I just am thinking about. We're hearing from a lot of men who don't know what to do right now either, and men who are managers, and they don't know what to do. I had somebody the other day tell me that they didn't want to have closed door meetings with women anymore. Well, you can't do that, or they don't want to take women out in the field with them for fear that, you know, they might do something wrong. And you know, we think, you know, that's, you know, going completely against what we're trying to do here.
The wrong approach.
Yeah, the wrong approach for one, but you know, that's going to prohibit women from advancing in the workplace again. So we really can't do that. And it's important that there is a dialogue between men and women on this topic, because you know, that's the only way there's going to be change, because if we work together and to recognize that everybody has different feelings and thoughts, and to hear that out. And so that we can bring people along and to understand. So
that's why I think it's important, Carrie, to really have a dialogue on what is sexual harassment and what is not sexual harassment. Because I've also heard a lot of men, you know, express this same sort of concern. They're like, you know, if I say, oh, I like your haircut, is that sexual harassment? Or, and I think that once we go to that extreme, I absolutely agree with you 100%. Then it has the opposite impact of what we're talking about. And then women's careers are stifled because they're not invited to the table where the real conversations are being held, the decision-making conversations, and they're not being included. So I think it's really important to have honest conversations about what is sexual harassment, what is not sexual harassment, etc.
So Allison, one of our pieces that we've written is, you know, kind of what's appropriate in the workplace. And one of our sort of rule to live by is if what you think you might say to someone, you could not say to that person's mother, then you probably shouldn't be saying it. You know, it's just kind of a basic thing. And, you know, you can say, you know, I like your shirt, but you can't say like, ooh, I like your shirt. You know, you wouldn't say it that way to that person's mother. Right. You know, that's not that. So
that's a good rule of thumb.
Yeah, we thought that was just a interesting rule of thumb to start out with, as you think about how to behave. It's because men have these questions. What do I do? How do I behave? I don't think of myself as a harasser, and certainly don't want to do that. So what can I do? And we
I
just
also think. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say.
Please go.
I think that the point about transparency around policies is, I share this concern about men shying away from women in the workplace. I think we're already seeing it happen, and it's really, to me, one of the worst things that could come out of Me Too is to have the Mike Pence rule, which is, I won't have dinner alone with a woman or take a woman on travel alone, come out of this, because I personally have benefited immensely in my career from male mentors who took me under their wing in a completely appropriate way. And I would hate for women who are coming up through the ranks now to not have those opportunities. Right. I think that there is so much confusion, as both Allison and Carrie said, around what the rules are. And I would just say one thing I've been really pushing employers on is it's not just about what's sexual harassment and what's not that needs clarification. I think in a lot of workplaces, there needs to be clarification around what's your interoffice dating policy like. For example, Facebook and Netflix and Airbnb all have the same rule, which is that you can ask somebody out one time. And if they say no, then that's a no. And if you're really busy and interested, you have to ask the person out, the next time. And there's no dating within control or management or supervisor relationships. Excellent. And I think, whatever the right rule is up to each employer, but people need to know about those things too. And what are the rules around alcohol or socializing outside of the office? And I think that it doesn't mean that all has to end, but there does need to be clarity around what's appropriate and what's not, and good training about that. And then I think that people will not be as nervous about where the lines are.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Any other points for that, ladies? Or I'll stick with Allie. I want to just curiously know, since you worked on Capitol Hill, can you compare if there are any distinctions between the type of harassment that happened there as opposed to what happens typically in newsrooms? Are they pretty much the same as far as what you see the interactions being, or are there any distinctions between other industries?
Yeah, I think that one thing that is similar is that there's often a lot of interactions with people who aren't within the traditional employer-employee relationship, but that nonetheless have a power dynamic that leads to these problems. And I think Allison illustrated that point really well with the source relationship in journalism, where the source really does have a lot of power over the story. And I think in politics you have lobbyists and you have consultants who are also trying to wield influence and power, who often end up in environments where this is a really big problem. I think the problem is especially pronounced in industries where the power dynamic is worse. And I think on Capitol Hill, that's especially difficult because of the sort of aura around members and elected officials, and you're really there in public service to serve them. And so especially I think we've seen where the staffers have a concern about their reelection or rocking the boat. I think those kinds of concerns tend to be there similarly to other industries where there's a worry about how it's going to affect your professional career or not. So I guess those are some of the things I see as sort of similar dynamics across industries and especially across these two. But I'm sure Carrie and Allison know a little bit more about, how those dynamics I mentioned play out in media.
I also would like to, and I'll throw it over to Carrie and Allison with regards to aspects that might impact the frequency and the type of harassment. What about distinctions between location, as far as whether the newsroom is in New York as opposed to a small town in the Midwest, whether there are more men than women in a particular newsroom? What other factors do you think contribute to how often and what kind of harassment journalists face? Do you think there are demographic distinctions or the size of the newsroom having an impact on the type of harassment and the frequency?
So I think this happens to everywhere across the country, no matter where you are, of women of all ethnicities and of all socioeconomic backgrounds. I just don't think there's any discrimination there on who this happens to. Hopefully a smaller, really well-managed newsroom isn't going to have those problems. We had a conversation this week with a really large news organization, and 75% of their EPs on shows are women. And they seem to be doing some really great things. One of our co-founders is a management consultant, and she will tell you that the data backs it up. When you have women in positions of management, that this kind of stuff can be dealt with. However, I know at least in my career, women can be bad managers too. So it's not an overarching solution in terms of bullying and other types of behavior. And the news industry, I think, lends itself to it because of how we work. Crazy hours on deadlines, breaking news situations. It is a really fast-paced, intense workplace, and when you're in a stressful situation, people can behave badly. Sometimes it just brings out the worst in people, and bullying and that sort of harassment will happen. But in general, I think it happens everywhere. I live in the Southeast now, and somebody said, "Oh, I don't think these problems must not happen down there because everyone's so nice and friendly and Southern charm and all that." And I said, "No, yeah,
right." And
no.
I think what muddies the water, and Carrie's gonna kill me for this, but I think it's true, and I think we would be remiss not to mention it. But I think what muddies the water is that you do have the rare person who is a climber, who puts him or herself out there and is unethical, what I would consider unethical, and will do whatever they can to get a certain position. And then the person who takes advantage of that says, well, so-and-so didn't have a problem with that, and this is how it's kind of done around here, and use it as an excuse to paint a broad brush and approach other people who should not be approached in that way. Did I kind of say that so you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I read between the lines very well. Thank you. No, and it's a real issue because
and I think that
Go ahead.
I think we have to admit that there are certain people who are the very minority who play a certain game, and that's what they do,
and are willing to compromise their ethics and morals and standards,
right, and are willing to do that. And I think that harms our movement and what we're trying to say. And I don't know if it's a matter of sort of re-educating them and saying you don't have to do this in order to get ahead. I don't know how we address that small element that abusers use as an excuse.
Ladies, I know that is a very interesting point and a very real point. Do you guys want to illuminate any further on that? And I do think that's an issue that plays a role, that there are people who are playing a certain game, as you stated, Allison, and that creates a harmful excuse to open the door to others who don't want to play that game. When another person encounters that same person who took advantage of someone's willingness to kind of go there.
Yeah, that is tricky. I'll say, in one of my personal experiences, I said no to the advances and got out of there. But I think about how many women had to have said yes for this person to be so brave and to continue to have that behavior. And now I know it was so widespread, I wasn't the only one. But I think that when there's such an imbalance of power, it can sometimes get tricky as to what consent can really mean. Someone who may have gone into it willingly because they felt like they had to, or they thought that was going to be a way for them to get ahead. I think, especially when you're young and just starting out, when you get older, you start to look back at that and go, and you think about Monica Lewinsky and her situation. She always said it was consensual. And she's just recently come out and said, with that imbalance of power, that was really tricky. And I think this is a part of the dialogue that is this is sort of a new thing. And this is a really hard thing to address and to talk about. And I certainly don't have the answers for it. but that's going to be part of this issue going forward, and the discussion we have, and how we all come to grips with it. I think that the people who go into it and thinking, I'm going to do this so I can get ahead, and try to use that to do that, I don't think they're compromising their morals and ethics. Quite frankly, I don't think they had them to begin with. But just to not to be controversial, but someone who's going to go and do that, is they're lacking the integrity that we need to keep the integrity of the American press.
Yep, maybe so, but it does exist, and
it does exist.
Yes, and
but
go ahead, Allie.
Go ahead. Well, I'm just going to say one more quick thing.
Oh, sorry.
There was a little bit of research recently that false claims really don't happen that often. Actually, I think the last number I saw was somewhere between 6 and 8% of claims are ever false. So it is rare. But
yeah, I think both that issue and the one Allison raised are important, and I'm glad that we're talking about them, because I do think that it's important to acknowledge these rare cases and to make sure that our policies and practices address them too. I mean, I think about that Rolling Stone article that came out about UVA and turned out to be one of those rare cases where there really wasn't the evidence to back up the story, and it really set back, I felt, the campus sexual assault debate for a while in a way that then, took some work to overcome. And so I do think that it's important to make sure that policies and practices address all scenarios. That's a lot of why I mentioned what I did about interoffice dating. I think that there probably should be a rule that anyone in a control relationship shouldn't be dating each other, so that there isn't an opportunity for a pattern of that to evolve, or permission to evolve around, it being okay for a manager or supervisor to date their subordinates, or anyone, for example, a CFO who's responsible for handing out the money in an organization can't do that without a conflict of interest if they're dating people within the organization. So I think that all needs to be a part of, clarity around this issue moving forward. And, I would just add, I do think that a lot of women who maybe have learned these behaviors, it's also because we've accepted it. I mean, it has been, obviously, we're now realizing, such a part of the culture in so many industries that men have, encouraged this behavior and allowed it. And so I think we're in a moment of a big cultural shift, and I think that I'm hopeful that will change.
I think you're right. I think journalism is just reflecting the society as a whole, and the awareness that's grown, and people's shifts in attitudes, both men and women. And I wanted to touch on, I know we talked a lot about women as victims. Are there male victims? And do we know the statistics as far as men in the newsroom and how they're affected by abuse, whether it's sexual harassment or bullying?
Yeah, I mean, I think we know this is a problem that affects all people, including men. I often talk about this as primarily a women's issue, because I do think women are overwhelmingly subjected to sexual harassment in the workplace. And I also think that the power dynamics make it harder for women to obtain relief from that when it happens, because there are so few women in positions of leadership and fewer women mentors to go to, not to minimize the experiences that men have, but I think they have more allies and mentors in most industries who will help them navigate that circumstance. They have a little more power institutionally to speak up and not fear that retaliation that we know is really widespread when you are in the minority. And I think that, one thing I've noticed about this issue, even just reflecting on my own experiences, is that the most egregious things that happened to me were between ages 18 and 22, when I had the least amount of power that I have ever had in the workplace. And I think as I accumulated more power in the form of mentorships or work experience, things started to dissipate for me. And I've noticed that I think the problem is worse whenever the power dynamic is worse, whether that's because you're a woman of color with fewer women of color in leadership, or a woman in a workplace that's very male dominated. I think those are the dynamics that make the problem worse for women, but I do think it's a problem that affects men, obviously, as well, too.
Especially in scenarios where it's same sex. And there have been a few cases maybe more than a few, but ones that I'm personally aware of, where you've had same-sex sort of harassment, asking people out inappropriately and that sort of thing, man on man, woman on woman.
Yeah, that also is a different dynamic that does pose issues. Let's talk about why management must start to begin, and maybe, again, this is too broad to say because now we've had a shift, but how can management ensure their support for people coming forward who are making allegations, and why should they take it seriously? What can a manager's mindset be shifted any more so than, the general feedback we've given so far? What can a manager do to show more support for folks coming forward making allegations?
Well, I would just say, you have to hear what the person is saying and take it into account. And no matter, you think about the people who've been exposed, no matter how unbelievable that scenario may be, you have to investigate because there may be some truth to it. I mean, some of these men were considered to be sort of national treasures, and these kind of things would never have happened, but they did. And so if a manager is faced with something like that and a report is given to them about someone within their newsroom who they respect and just would think, oh gosh, that person would never do that, an investigation has to happen. And a manager has to listen and take that information and really dig in. And if it turns out that, that behavior happened and it's true, there has to be zero accountability, and, the punishment has to fit the crime. I'm not saying, everyone needs to be fired and to never come back, but, a manager really has to dig in, and that's how I think the trust is going to be built, when people see that's happening.
I also would like to give an opportunity to anyone who's comfortable, and we do have some questions online. Again, thank you everyone who's attending this panel discussion. We want to hear from you. Make sure you go ahead and type in your questions. We want to have the panel address those issues that you're bringing forward, and we're taking them now. So make sure you please go ahead and share your questions. I wanted to ask if anyone on the panel is comfortable enough to share maybe not naming names, but specific information as far as how an instance of harassment played out for you, and what you did or how it occurred and how it was later addressed. I'd like to see if we could talk a little bit about something that happened to one of you individually and how it was resolved or wasn't resolved. Carrie, would you mind sharing an instance?
Sure. Unfortunately, I have a couple to choose from, but, sort of the most egregious was a quid pro quo, and it was going to what was a job interview for me, and what I saw as a real opportunity. And I regret that at the time I was very young, and I got an email from the person that was completely inappropriate very late at night. And I said, oh gosh, that person must be drinking. He's going to regret this tomorrow. I'm smart. I can get this back on track. And I thought I did. And then I went to the interview, and everything was professional until the very end. At which point I said, I really want to talk about next steps in getting over here. And I was propositioned and said, it was quid pro quo. Let's go do something, and we can talk about next steps. But until, I was willing to do something, we weren't going to talk about next steps. So I didn't get a job there. I didn't work there. So I didn't know what to do. I was young. I don't think at the time I actually understood my rights. I didn't know it was illegal, what had happened to me. And I think, to Allie's point, the first thing you need to do is know your rights. And so there was no resolution to that for me. And because of these kind of incidences, that's one of the reasons I left the business ultimately. So.
Yeah, I would just echo that experience, and that, my story that I ended up talking to a Washington Post reporter about in October when Me Too was taking off was something also from when I was very young that really sent a message to me as a young woman in the profession that this is something that you need to assume as a risk and shouldn't be surprised, to encounter. And I think that the most damaging part of that for me was realizing I didn't report it through formal channels, because as I started to talk to people about it informally, I realized everyone already knew that this person was a problem. And the solution, which we've now seen really play out in a lot of industries, was to warn people away from, working for this employer. And I think that's going to perpetuate gender inequality across professions, because to Carrie's point, you're going to lose good talent and people who come into an industry excited and eager to be there, and then are faced with the answer of, you can be here in some workplaces, but not in others unless you're willing to play this game. And I think that's what is so hopeful about the Me Too movement, is I hope this is the end of that era. But, likewise for me, I think that was the resolution and the experience that I had early on in my career as well.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, ladies. So what does the future look like in terms of what can your organizations, whether it's SBJ, whether it's the Purple Campaign, or Press Forward, do and are doing to change culture in the newsroom? And do you see, or are you seeing a shift?
So I'll start. Press Forward's had the opportunity to talk with a lot of the networks, just this week, and every one of them is doing something, and they all recognize that this is a big problem and they want change. So I think that is really hopeful, and I applaud them all. What we hope to do is, we believe culture change just doesn't happen overnight, and you can't just put in a whole new slew of policies and expect the problem to be gone. That we really have to understand the problem first. Take the plane engine from Southwest that breaks. There's a whole study into it, and looking at all the problems and making sure it never happened again. We have to do that too as an industry as a whole. So our sort of main thing we're going to do is a study to create an industry blueprint for best practices on this issue and bullying and equality as a whole, so that we can elevate all women in the workplace. And really doing that deep dive, I think, is what's going to get us there.
Excellent. It sounds like starting with a framework of guidelines that folks can adopt and follow will help set the tone.
Yeah, that'll be our deliverable. A set of guidelines and best practices for what everyone can do. And we're going to have participation from newsrooms across the country, not just the big newsrooms in New York. Print, TV, radio, everywhere. So that, we really understand the problem and can give real feedback and real solutions based on data.
How about SBJ, Allison?
I think we'd like to look at mentorship, because a lot of women feel as though there are people in the newsroom they can't really talk to. And when something happens right away, they want to be able to pick up the phone and say, what do you think I should do? Which is, and oftentimes they know what they should do, but it's the calming effect of having someone who's been there before you, who has been in the business a longer time, to say, okay, breathe, tell me exactly what's happened, who's not in the newsroom, who's only vested in you as your mentor. So I think we're looking at establishing mentorships for women who want them, younger women who want to be mentored by older women, and in partnership with other organizations like Press Forward, because the person doesn't necessarily have to be in the newsroom or a journalist per se, but someone who can sort of talk them through it and help them along the way with the steps, the best practices, and how to report it and who they should report it to, and that sort of thing.
Allie, do you want to add anything? And we're going to go now to our online questions after your comment.
Yeah, and I see one on the chat screen that ties in nicely to what I was going to say, which is, so I'll go ahead and kill two birds with one stone there. The question was about whether there are examples of men doing the right thing and what other men can do. And we have been learning from what the general counsel of Airbnb is doing, which I think he's really leading on this issue in a way that lots of industries can learn from. And we hosted a fireside chat with him in San Francisco that you can live stream on our website. And what he personally does, Airbnb sexual harassment training with every employee in the company. And they have 4,000 employees across global offices. And he goes out and he sits with employees himself and walks them through what the rules are at Airbnb, what's allowed, what's not allowed. And he also does really great bystander training, I think, for men. You know, one of the things I believe is that the messenger is really important a lot of the time. And I think that, you know, he'll ask and encourage men at Airbnb, if you hear something in a meeting that just didn't sound right to you or sit right to you or overheard or saw an interaction, even if you're not sure if it violates technically corporate policies, you know, you can always pull, say, the woman aside and as Allison mentioned earlier, you know, say, hey, are you all right? That didn't seem right to me. And I think just being heard and seen goes such a long way for people who've just been belittled or otherwise discriminated against. And I think men can also play a role by pulling the man aside and saying, you know, hey, man to man, like, you shouldn't say that and let me tell you why. And I think that those kinds of actions, in addition to the sort of more formal training and the tone being set from the top, can really go a long way.
Absolutely. Thank you for answering that. And let's go to a couple other questions online. Let me see. Hi, is there a good example template for how to document? I think we mentioned that earlier.
Sure.
Can we go into a little bit more detail?
Sure. I would say really and truly going to betterbrave.com is going to give you the templates to print out and take you through it step by step. And I think they're a great resource for that. So it's betterbrave.com, and they tell you what to do if you were the one being harassed, if you still work there, if you don't work there anymore, or if you were fired from there. They tell you if you're a bystander, you know, they give you ideas on how you can help and how you can document the behavior so that you can be a witness for this person that you're trying to help. And then again, on our website, thepressforward.org, you can read Gretchen Carlson's her suggestions, and within that, you know, learn more about, you know, how to document. I mean, she talks about printing out emails, recording conversations if that is legal. Those rules vary from state to state, but really trying to get as much information as you can to support your case.
Absolutely. So we're going to look at, for you, ma'am, or anonymous attendee, go to betterbrave.com. Next question. How do you deal with bullying by your woman boss when you are a woman? Some say I should talk with her about this or just try to avoid her as much as possible. The latter seems safer. She violates my personal space all the time. I feel my status has diminished under her. Who'd like to address that?
Well, I think that avoiding these kind of situations only makes them worse. So I'm a big fan of asking the person off property if it's appropriate, or taking them to another part of the building where you can sort of be alone, and talking to them about the behavior that is not conducive to the work environment. But I think it's really important to keep emotion out of it. And this is where documentation is also important, to be able to give specific examples. You did this, it resulted in this, which means that my role in this position was diminished. So I think it's really important to have that conversation, because the next sort of thing is to go above that person's head if it's to the point where you can't work, or it's somehow impacting the quality of the work, which therefore impacts the quality of the product and impacts the business. But you have to be able to say that you had a word with the person, because I think a lot of times some of these things are just misunderstandings. Yes, sometimes it really is full-on bullying, but sometimes it can also just be a sort of misunderstanding. And so I think it's really important to not avoid it, because avoiding it doesn't address the situation and it doesn't help. You have to actually sit down and have a conversation with the person.
Ladies, would you like to add anything else?
I mean, I would just reiterate the, the advice about finding out what the policies are in your workplace. Oftentimes employers and the mission statement of your organization or integrity values or your code of conduct might actually prohibit the conduct that's happening to you, much like sexual harassment is prohibited. And if that's the case, there may be, formal reporting channels or others that are available to address the problem. But I agree with Allison that, even if you don't know that talking directly to this person is going to solve the problem, talking to somebody, again, whoever it is that you might trust the most to give you advice about this in the workplace is a good idea, because I do agree that, these problems, especially people who have been enabled for a long time and abusive tendencies, aren't going to be fixed without light being shed on it in some way. So I would agree with that.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback off what Allie said, documenting as well. Once you finish those steps that Allie just laid out and Allison laid out, if this behavior rises to the point that it is not okay within your policy manual, you need to document that behavior just like you would sexual harassment. It can rise to the level of being a different type of harassment. So you wind up following the same steps.
I think that's a good segue to our next question. Ms. Estrada has written, I know this conversation is about sexual harassment. However, bullying is another factor in the workplace. How should an employee handle being bullied? And how should someone identify retaliation once reported? So first, let's define workplace bullying. Anyone would like to take that?
I mean, I think that, oftentimes this sort of relates back to the question you asked me about the Hill and, unique dynamics there. But part of the reason I think you often see bullying, environments that tolerate bullying, which I guess I would define as, any actions that demean, belittle, degrade, discriminate against, make a person feel disempowered in the workplace, tend to also be places where you find sexual harassment is tolerated, because there's a sense that if you are a subordinate, you have less power, fewer rights, and a devaluation as a human being that really does occur in environments where people are expected to tolerate behavior that I think, based on integrity values of the company or otherwise that we could all agree on, shouldn't be tolerated. And they're often accompanied with a real fear of speaking up, and I think a culture of confidentiality or not rocking the boat, or where troublemakers are especially disfavored, whether that's, I've seen this problem, for example, in the judiciary or in national security field, where confidentiality is really, really prized. I think people are more afraid to push back or rock the boat. So I think the same advice we gave about, a female boss or other boss who's harassing you in other ways would apply here. Just think it's really important to find out what the policies are and what your options are for recourse, and to speak up about it. I think that there was a great quote that I saw recently that said, the most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. And I think that, by just knowing that you do have a right to be in a workplace environment that's free from bullying and harassment, and that you deserve an employer who's going to support you in that, is important. And my hope is that doesn't mean you have to leave your workplace and that you'll find support there. But I think, if not, maybe it is time to make a change to a place where you are more respected and valued as an employee.
And I think that bullies tend to be part of the whole act of bullying is for show. So people very rarely bully behind closed doors. I mean, they do it and make fun of people and jokes and in front of other people to sort of boost themselves a little bit. So it's a little easier to document and a little easier to have sort of witnesses to this sort of activity.
Can someone address that part about retaliation? Her second half said, how should an employee handle being bullied, and how should someone identify retaliation once reported? Give some examples about of how retaliation is materializes, or examples of what it looks like.
I mean, it can be anything from the most obvious, which is being fired, to something a little bit more subtle, as in you're not getting the stories that you want to get to work on. You're, not being given chances to advance your career within your workplace. To, if you're outed as someone who's come forward for the behavior, to that person continuing to bully you by saying, this person tried to do this, and harming your reputation. So I think it can run the gamut from really small things, such as dropping little lines here and there as you do your work, to the really big things as losing your job. And that's illegal. So
Right.
Again, go document it. And Better Brave has resources for if you've been retaliated against. So,
Elsa, were you going to add anything there?
No, Carrie is on point.
Ladies, I'm thoroughly enjoying this conversation, but we're almost out of time. We have a few minutes left, and I would like to leave some time for you guys to leave final comments. I know we've touched on a myriad of topics, but whatever you'd like our viewers and our audience to be left with regards to what we can do as individuals to push the culture forward in support of more transparency, and obviously building an environment that is less welcoming and less tolerating of this type of behavior. Whether through the context of your various organizations or us as individuals who are participating today. We'd love for you to give your final comments and hopefully inspire us to have faith that we will continue to push forward in the right direction. Let's start with Miss Allison Bethel McKenzie.
I'd like to step out a little bit and say to all the women, particularly the women of color, that you may be in a newsroom situation where you're the only one or the first one or one of two or three. And you may find it harder to address the issue or step out or complain because you believe that you'll be the first. No one will believe you, and you're expendable, and you'll be fired right away because you're a person of color. But I think that we have to get out of any sort of cultural don't ask, don't tell historical thing that we have, and really think about what it does for all women, regardless of race, where they're from in the world or in the country, and speak out. Because at the end of the day, the more we let it pass, the more it will happen to the next woman. Because it's usually not just done in isolation, this sexual harassment or these inappropriate acts. So I would encourage people to find a way, whether they speak to a mentor, go to HR, or however they choose to handle it, but to make it be known that it's not okay. It's not okay. It's not the norm. It should not be, and even if it is, it should not be the norm. And it's simply not okay.
Excellent advice. Next, we'll go to Ms. Allie Coll Steele, attorney and president, co-founder of the Purple Campaign.
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been a really interesting conversation. Thank you for hosting it. I think we've covered a lot of what I would say, but I would just emphasize that I really believe that everybody has a role to play in this movement. And if you're not sure what your role is, starting a conversation about that with your friends, with your coworkers, to find out what it is you can do to help push for the right kind of change. It may be, if you're a man in a position of leadership, or maybe even say a middle manager, it may just be mentoring a woman who you might not have mentored before and providing another opportunity and resource for her to learn from you about the career and also have an ally in the workplace should anything happen. It may be being a good bystander. It might just be being a resource for somebody, or asking the right questions. If you are a person with position of power in particular, I think in your workplace, whether that's because you know you have leverage because you're really good at your job, or you are, you know, in a position where you supervise others, especially those people, I would encourage to make their voices heard and set a tone within their own work environment that this kind of behavior isn't going to be tolerated. And really that reporting is an act of courage and not something that people should be blacklisted for, but actually something that should be seen as, you know, a good employee trait, is that you are not afraid to report illegal behavior in the workplace. It's, you know, really eye-opening to me to realize how much that's not been the case in a lot of environments, and it's seen as a bad quality. And I think we really need to get at that if we're going to fix the problems. And I think everybody can do their part to make change on that.
Excellent. And finally, Carrie.
Well, first, thank you, Suzette, and the SPJ for hosting this webinar. I think it has been a really interesting conversation. And Allie and Allison have both said some wonderful things here, and I don't want to repeat it, but I just want to say, you know, for anyone out there who's struggling with this, don't give up. You know, change is coming. This has been a watershed moment and in the American history, and change is coming if it's not already there for you. You know, at Press Forward, we're not going to let this wane from the spotlight. We are here. We are fighting for you. We are out there because we believe in this, and we believe that this is such an important issue that, you know, we're working tirelessly for no money, day in and day out, when we have full-time jobs and families, just because this is so important. So it's not going to go away. You know, there's going to be a second wave of reporting on these issues about what these places knew and when they knew it, and what they're doing to make that change. And we feel that wave is coming soon, and that this is not going to be tolerated anymore. And so please join us and be part of that change, and speak up, and know that there are people out there fighting for you daily. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, ladies, we are now out of time. On behalf of SPJ Florida, we want to say a heartfelt thank you for sharing your experiences, your expertise, and shedding light on this subject matter, as we hopefully can continue to have an impact on making newsrooms places that are safe for everyone. We want to once again thank Ms. Allison Bethel McKenzie from SPJ. She's the new executive director. Not so new, I'll say new one more time, but executive director. Thank you so much. And we want to encourage everyone to check out what each of their organizations is doing and seeing how you can plug in and become a part of the movement. We also want to thank again Ms. Allie Coll Steele, president and co-founder of the Purple Campaign. Thank you.
Thank you.
And again, Ms. Carrie Hughes Weeks, co-founder of Press Forward. Ladies, we've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I hope we'll be back and get to continue it further. Thank you again, and thanks to all of our attendees.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
We appreciate it.
And Christiana off camera is like, thank you. So, again, Suzette Speaks. It's been my pleasure to moderate this panel, and we'll sign off now and hopefully see you at another discussion soon. Have a great night.
Bye-bye.